For agents installed on servers that are monitored using the SolarWinds Observability self-hosted system, it is possible to monitor the server's response time and availability in two ways. The first method is by using the agent's own status. The second method is by using ICMP, or simply ping. Let's take a look. This is the SolarWinds system we have. We have two servers, an application server and a database server. Both are monitored using an agent installed on them. Let's take a look at their resources. Click on List Resources. On the application server, as you can see, response time and availability monitoring, which SolarWinds refers to as status, is performed through the agent. Now let's switch to the database server view, where we can see that availability and response time are monitored using ICMP. I'd like to say a few words about monitoring response time and availability using the agent versus monitoring them using ICMP. First of all, it's important to point out that each method has its own advantages and disadvantages. For example, in an environment with strict firewall rules, we may prefer not to allow ICMP access from SolarWinds to the monitored server. In that case, from a security perspective, we will most likely prefer to use the agent to monitor the server's response time and availability, since the ports required for agent-based monitoring are already open. On the other hand, if we choose to monitor the server status through the agent, and the agent itself encounters a problem and goes down, it does not necessarily mean there is an issue with the server or its operating system. It may simply indicate a problem with the agent. In this situation, where the agent status is also considered the server's status, things can become confusing when configuring alerts. For example, if we receive an alert indicating that the agent is down, does that mean the entire server is down or only the agent? Of course, it is possible to create a more advanced alert that performs additional checks to determine whether the server itself is actually down. However, that makes the configuration more complex, and in most cases, we prefer to keep things simple. For that reason, monitoring server availability using ICMP may actually be the simplest approach. Ultimately, every organization needs to evaluate its own requirements and trade-offs and decide which method is the most appropriate for monitoring the basic status of its servers. That was the introduction to the main topic of this video, which is how to automatically switch in SolarWinds after installing an agent on a monitored server, from using the agent to monitor response time and availability to using ping instead. So, let's go back to the SolarWinds system. When we add a server for monitoring using an agent installed on it, whether the agent was installed manually or through an automated deployment, the monitored server's status and response time will, by default, be monitored through the agent. This is the system's default behavior after an agent is installed. To the best of my knowledge, there is no way to change this behavior through installation parameters, whether the installation is manual or unattended. Now, if your goal is to monitor status and response time through the agent, then that's perfectly fine, and it works exactly as expected. But what if you want status and response time to be monitored using ping instead, regardless of the agent status? One option is to manually open each server where an agent has been installed and change the monitoring method from agent to ICMP using these radio buttons. That is certainly possible, but it is not an ideal approach. If you think about an organization where a significant number of servers are added to monitoring every day, this manual process becomes a source of forgotten steps, human errors, and unnecessary operational overhead, all of which can eventually lead to monitoring issues. A much better approach is to automate the switch from agent-based status monitoring to ICMP-based status monitoring. Now, there's a way to do this using SWQL. Let's take a look at the relevant SWQL. Since SWQL is part of the SolarWinds API, this is a relatively safe approach because all changes are made through the API. We'll run the first query and see what it returns. The first query is for the application server. I'm assuming you already have a basic understanding of the pollers concept in SolarWinds. I'll just point out that each server returns 4 rows in the results because they represent the combination of 2 polling methods, ICMP and agent, together with 2 different metrics, response time and status. As you can see, for this server, response time and status are currently being monitored by the agent. If you remember, we saw this earlier in the video. The agent polars are present, and their status value is set to true. On the other hand, the ICMP polar for this server have their status set to false. If we run the same query against the database server that is monitored by SolarWinds, we can see the opposite. The ICMP polars have their status set to true, while the agent polars are set to false. Now let's go back to the first server, the application server, where status and response time are currently being monitored through the agent. If we want these metrics to be monitored using ICMP instead, all we need to do is change the two values associated with the agent polars to false and change the two values associated with the ICMP polars to true. There's a PowerShell script that performs this change automatically for every node where it is applicable. The script first runs a query to identify all agent polars whose status is currently set to true. There are two such polars, one for response time and one for status. It then changes both of them to false. Next, it changes the two corresponding ICMP polars to true. Of course, the goal is to automate the entire process. You can run the script whenever it makes sense for your environment. Once a day, once an hour, or immediately after an agent is installed, regardless of how the installation was performed. That part is entirely up to you. I'll include a link to the script in the comments, so you can use it in your own environment. As always, I recommend testing it first in a test environment or under controlled testing conditions before using it in production. The script was developed and tested with SolarWinds Observability Self-Hosted version 2026.1. Future versions may introduce changes to the database schema or the API, so you should always validate the script in your environment before running it.